All right, you're looking to make some picks this week at the Open Championship. We got to give you the most important stats to figure out. We're looking at all of the recent winners of the Open Championship, their historical data of why they did so well at the Open that week. Ron Klos from Betsperts. He's the guru on all things stats. He's going to dive into all of this with us today, including Shane Lowry's win at Portrush in 2019. Let's start with this one. We're looking at the last 11 winners of the Open Championship. Maybe pick a guy who played well in one other major that year. Here's the results of the other 3 majors from the winner that year. 9 of them had one top 10, but only 3 of those 11 Open winners had 2 or more top 10s in major championships that year. It's a lot to dive into, and I'm glad Ron Klos is with me for this key stats video on Golfbet. Ron, it's been a long time. I'm glad to have you this week, man.
Chris, great to be here. Really looking forward to this week. Royal Portrush is, of course, I don't remember a whole lot from 2019. I went back and watched, some of that tournament, and I'm really excited to see how it plays this year. I think it's an interesting test, especially with how it's a little bit different than a normal links course, and so really excited to talk about some stats with you here.
We have a lot to dive into. We're going to make it as easy and simple as possible for you in the next 15 minutes. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube, all your big stats, and also go follow Ron on X. PGA Splits 101 there on the bottom of your screen. You got the rabbit hole, which I know it focuses a lot on PGA Tour shot link data, which we don't have this week, but Ron does have a lot of interesting information for us this week. We're going to go over it here again in the next 15 minutes. Let's look at what Shane Lowry did as the backdrop in 2019 at Portrush, because you're going to see here are his 3 biggest and best stats that he excelled at over the field. It's greens in regulation, it's scrambling, and it's par 4 scoring. We're going to go over the first 2 in a lot of detail, and you're also going to note that what he did at Royal Portrush in 2019 is almost identical to what all the other winners at other Opens did in previous years. So Portrush is not this unique place. It's the same kind of concept, same key stats as all the other Open Championships. And Ron, we start with greens in regulation and why they are so important. Look at this list. The last 8 winners of the Open Championship and how well they did in greens in regulation that week winning.
Yeah, so, the term second shot course, I think, is often overused, but it genuinely applies here at Royal Portrush, where approach play, I believe, is more critical than many of the other venues on the Open rotation. And, the reason for that is you have a combination of small, elevated greens, which are very unique to links courses. They also have subtle undulations and challenging runoffs, and you throw in the coastal winds. And that's a whole nother topic. Encourage people, before you make any picks, keep checking that weather forecast. Thursday does look to be the day that looks windy right now. But there's just going to be a premium on precision with irons and wedges into these greens. And like you said, looking at this list, looking back even at 2019 specifically, it's no surprise that Shane Lowry, and then you look at even a guy like Tommy Fleetwood, elite ball strikers, also who have excellent skill around the greens. I know we're going to look at scrambling here soon as well. But those 2 finish atop the leaderboard. And so, yeah, I just think this is a real interesting course this week because, unlike most links courses that have large, flat greens, players can use the ground game to kind of run the ball onto those greens. And there's straightforward recovery options. Royal Portrush is an entirely different story. You have a majority of these holes, you have to have an aerial approach. And, if you want to avoid those penal green surrounds, you're also dealing with greens that are, again, much smaller than a typical links venue, only about 5,400 square feet on average.
And here's the most interesting part of this whole greens and regulation conversation. Let's talk about when players miss the fairway off the tee and why approach from the rough is so important. Again, these are the Open champions, the winners of the Open since 2016. Look at the greens that they are hitting in the rough compared to what the field did that week. Our winners were hitting 62% of the greens, and the field's only hitting about 46, 47. 15% difference in the winner to the field on the average hitting the green from the rough, and the birdie conversion is the same. 8% different from the winners to the guys in the field on average making birdie from the rough. What does that tell you about maybe the lack of importance off the tee. You don't want to spray it, but is the tee game that important when you see these numbers?
So this week specifically is really interesting to me off the tee because we have 8 dog legs, and that's kind of unusual for a links course.
Yeah.
You have 5 holes with out of bounds off the tee. All sorts of thick vegetation is just a few yards off the fairways. So it's real interesting to look and see, how it has played. Missing the fairway doesn't seem to be as penal in some of these other courses, but I think it may be a little different this week. And it'll be interesting to look back once it's over at what the data shows. But I'm definitely favoring accuracy over distance off the tee. I don't think this is a week where you can get away with bombing it. Although I will say, watching some of the overheads of some of these holes, a guy like Rory McIlroy, will he take some chances and
Right.
try to cut the corners of these dog legs? Because, that's another interesting thing about this course is the danger areas are when you hit over the dog leg. So at the same time, that's the best angle into the green. And so it's kind of like Harry Cole, too. Again, this is one of his masterpieces. Kind of testing players here where if you want to take that line off the tee and cut across the dog leg, you're going to have an easier approach shot, but you're also risking all kinds of danger. So I think club head speed is another thing to look at as far as from the rough. I think when you look at some of those guys, and we have that data in the rabbit hole where you can look at club head speed, you can look at greens and regulation from the rough. But, guys like Bryson DeChambeau, Adam Scott, Max Gracerman, Wyndham Clark, these are all guys who I think are interesting looks when we're looking at from the rough here.
So if we're calling a greens and regulation approach game a key stat, I think maybe even bigger key stat this week, scrambling. Let's look at those same last 8 winners at the Open. Every single one of them, Ron, was inside the top 7 in scrambling that week. And here's what makes it more interesting. This is the most important scrambling week of the entire year on the PGA Tour. In fact, we go back to 2016. The Open and the RSM Classic were the 2 events on tour that had the most winners ranking inside the top 5 that week for scrambling. Notice no other major championship is on here. The US Open's not on here. The Masters is not on here. This is the week where scrambling matters the most. What do you make of that?
So typical of most links courses, you're going to have all sorts of tricky areas around the green. But I think here at Portrush specifically, because many of these greens are elevated, saving par is going to mean facing recovery shots from well below the level of the actual green. And so, these tightly mown runoffs and tricky lies, and, you have all these hummocks and hollows and moguls, and just watching, watching the overheads and what these greens look like. Players are going to have to get creative. We're talking anything from a putter to a lob wedge. I even went back and watching the 2019, some guys were taking 8 irons, 5 woods. Mm-hmm. So it's the guys who have the ability to get creative in scrambling around the green. I think that's something I'm looking at really high this week. Tiger Woods also had, he missed the cut here in 2019, but he had a pretty insightful quote about short game performance. He said, the difference between this layout versus most of the Open layouts is the ball seems to repel around the greens a lot more. And he said, you're going to have a lot of either bump on chips or slow putts coming up the hills. So, for me, it's just paramount for guys who, are really good scrambling, especially from the short grass. Those tight lies are going to test many of those guys this week.
When you're looking at your stats and you're trying to figure out who you like, let's say there's somebody on your list who doesn't really pop in a stat that you find that's important. So let me get your thoughts on this. What's kind of the cutoff on how well a guy needs to be gaining strokes, losing strokes? Let's say somebody's not a great scrambler. What's your cutoff line for a red flag, so to speak, if you want to pick somebody this week who's not a great scrambler? Are they like 200th in the world in scrambling? Do they need to be top 50? What is it?
Yeah, I think a lot of that also depends on how good they are on approach.
Okay.
So you take a guy like Victor Hovland, who is one of the best approach players, one of the most elite iron players in the world. We all know he has trouble scrambling from the short grass. And so, for me, I think those two kind of go hand in hand. If you look at the greens and reg here in 2019, I think they were right around 64%. So, they're not too difficult here. Now, obviously, the wind and the weather can change that very quickly. But for me, I'm not really looking as much as, okay, if they're ranked past this number, I'm not playing them. But if they're not elite at one or the other, ideally, obviously, you want guys who are good in both. But if they're not elite in one or the other, I'm probably going to cross them off my list this week, because if you're not hitting greens and you struggle from around the green, that's a huge red flag.
So those are the two big stats in a nutshell: greens in regulation and scrambling. We don't really need to go over par 4 scoring. It kind of tells itself. Most of your holes are par 4s. The winner's going to do well on the most holes. What we do want to go over is, it's the old debate of history on a course, call it the Open in general, versus recent form. And I think this week's kind of interesting about looking at the past winners and how they did leading up to the Open that week. Here's what we're going to do. This is a lot of information on this screen, but we're going to simplify this for you. We're looking at the last 7 winners of the Open, how they did their previous 5 starts leading up to that win that year. You'll notice that Stenson in 2016 is not on this list like he was on all the other ones, because he didn't play a whole lot of PGA Tour events that year leading up, so it's kind of a weird thing going back 8 months for 5 events. This is 5 events for the last 7 winners. I'm just going to read these 3 big things off the top for you. 6 of our 7 winners had 2 top 10s leading up in those 5 events. 6 of the 7 winners had a top 5 leading up in those 5 events. And 4 of the 7 winners had 2 top 5s leading up. So what it really tells us is your winner of the Open is playing really good golf in terms of being on the leaderboard at the end of the week in those previous 5 weeks. So we're looking at what happened in the Scottish Open. We're looking at the Travelers. We're looking at Memorial. We're going maybe as far back as maybe the U.S. Open and the PGA Championship. What's your thought on form of the winner needing to be to a certain level for you?
Yeah, and this course is going to test every club in the bag. And so I'm looking for guys who have been consistent in each of the strokes gain categories. And obviously that's going to also correlate with, good recent form, like you said there. So, I look at a guy like Jon Rahm, who, 7th at the U.S. Open last week. Obviously he's on live, make of that what you will, but, runner up again last week at Valderrama. So he's a guy who I think, looking back at his Open history, he's got 2 top 10s in his last 2 trips here, was 3rd back in 2021. He's one of the best scramblers from short grass in the world. He's a guy who kind of checks that recent form box for me. And then you got a bunch of other guys, we've had multiple tour winners this week who have never won before. You look at a guy like Ryan Fox, who's won twice, one of the best links players in the entire world. And that's another thing I'm going to be factoring highly, that you can find on the rabbit hole, is links course history. And so Ryan Fox checks a lot of those boxes. Matt Fitzpatrick, you want to talk about recent form. He's got 2 top 8s in the last month here. And when putting is kind of the one thing that he's kind of a little inconsistent on, like that's been his strength for his whole career. So he's a guy who, if he can just put everything together this week, I think he has a great chance. And then you have some other names, guys who are fighting for the Ryder Cup. A guy like Ben Griffin, who's just been consistently good. You want to look at recent form, you can go back to the start of the year with him. Tommy Fleetwood, Sepp Straka. So those are a bunch of guys. Even the favorite of I don't know if we'll call him a favorite, but the darling of a lot of people, Cam Young, who's had some good success here at these Open courses. He also has 2 recent top 5s. So if we're looking at recent form,
pick him for a top 20. Pick him for a top 20, not a top 5.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah, man, we really appreciate you hopping on with us this week. We hope the video helped everybody out there. Go ahead and tell people where they can find all your stuff, all the awesome information, and how you came about it, and how it will help people.
Yeah, so the Rabbit Hole, like you said earlier, is a PGA Tour database that basically breaks down every course into filters and, every single metric you can think of. The PGA Tour site is an awful site, and so it takes all those metrics, and basically you can filter them out by time frame, by number of rounds, by courses, by course types. Pretty much any course condition you can think of, you can kind of recreate the tournament that, whatever's going on this week. And that's kind of the goal of it, is to kind of recreate tournament conditions and helping people, whether you play, DFS, whether you're betting on golf, and you can create your own models. We're really appreciative of the partnership we have with PGA Tour.
All right, man. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Appreciate it.